welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India at the Jan Mikulski Foundation, Bethak. This is our last session for the day. We request you to kindly proceed to the front lawns after this session for the final debate and the last session of the Jaipur Literature Festival. We are now going to introduce the next session, A History of Heart. And I will quickly introduce the speakers. Mr. Sandeep Jauhar has written 3 books, all published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. A practicing cardiologist, he is also a frequent contributor to the opinion section of the New York Times. He has appeared frequently on National Public Radio, CNN, MSNBC to discuss issues related to medicine. His essays have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Time, and Slate. Mr. Pariksith Singh, MD, is the CEO of Access Healthcare, one of the largest group practices in Florida, USA. He is an essayist, poet, story writer, translator, and medical educator who has published 7 anthologies of poetry in Hindi and English. He has also published the Healthcare Primer 2018, Healthcare Compliance, and Medicare Risk Adjustment. May we please welcome the speakers on stage, and may we please have a round of applause for the speakers.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session. We are extremely pleased to welcome our guest, Dr. Sandeep Jauhar from New York. He's a little jet-lagged, so you have to be kind to him. Don't throw him any wingers or any curveballs. So I will go to the heart of the matter. Sandeep, what is this book about?
Hi. So anyway, thank you for having me. It's really, first I want to say, been a real honor to be here and to talk about my book at this festival is really a great privilege and honor, and I really want to thank Sanjoy and William and all the organizers for inviting me. So, you know, I'll talk a little bit about the book, and then we can have a little discussion, and then we can take questions. So let me just say a few things. I'll say 4 things, okay. So first, let me just talk about my motivation for writing the book. The book is a history of the human heart from many different perspectives: personal, cultural, medical, but it's also a personal story, very, very much of a personal story. And the personal story really was the main motivation for writing the book. And it starts with my grandfather, who died in his early 50s in rural Kanpur in 1953. The story is that he was bitten by a snake while he was working in a shop close to his home. He was moving some sacks of grain and suffered this snake bite. Now, snake bite is fairly common in India, as you know, back in rural Kanpur, it was something that was not really that surprising. And my grandfather didn't really see what kind of snake it was. So, but he went home, and he was by all accounts feeling fine. He started to have lunch, and then some neighbors came in, bringing the snake that they claimed bit my grandfather. It had been killed by a snake charmer, and it was a black cobra, a very poisonous snake. And my grandfather took one look at it and said, "How can I survive this?" Now, he was actually sitting having lunch with my father, who was only 13 and a half years old. He was getting ready to go to college, and they had been talking about my father's academic achievements and so on. They were having a great conversation. They're having lunch, and when my grandfather got sight of the snake, he said, I cannot survive this." He slumped to the ground and went unconscious. And the last words he said were I wanted to see Prem go to college, my father, Prem. So, the family obviously was shocked. They didn't know what was going on. They assumed it was the snake bite that had killed. They actually didn't even know that my grandfather had died. I mean, they were in such shock. Back then, an ambulance used to come through the village, and it came several hours later, and the family flagged down the ambulance and asked them to take my grandfather, who was already in a sort of rigor mortis. I mean, he had been dead for several hours, but the family insisted that they take him to the hospital along with the snake. At the hospital, a doctor pronounced my grandfather dead on arrival, and he told the family it wasn't a snake, it was a heart attack, which presumably was from shock from looking at the snake. And that was sort of the story that entered our family lore, which was, this sudden death of the family patriarch. And it was a, very turbulent, tumultuous time for the family, as you can imagine. My father was in my grandfather's presence when he died, and he died suddenly, within minutes, and he never got over it. My father passed away about a year ago, but I would say for the next 60, 70 years, there were still times when he would, become very emotional, would start to cry, remembering his father. So he had a reaction that many people have when a loved one dies suddenly. And so, that reaction really suffused the entire family. Like the whole environment of the family was really dominated by this death that had occurred 15 years before I was born. That experience really led to a sort of obsession that I developed about the human heart. The heart was, when I was a kid, I would think about the heart as, being this incredible workhorse, right? I mean, we know that our hearts beat every single second for our entire lives, right? So that amounts to about 3 billion heartbeats. 3 billion. It's really astounding. And, the heart pumps blood through roughly 100,000 miles of blood vessels. If you take a human heart and you connect it to a swimming pool with a tube and the heart pumps, that swimming pool would empty within about a week. Okay, that sort of gives you the sort of gargantuan scale. But at the same time, this heart, this organ, led to a sudden death, right? It felled my grandfather, who was really healthy, right? There was nothing wrong with him before he had a heart attack. Obviously he had, some heart disease, but it wasn't visible. And this was something that I became really obsessed with when I was a kid, which was that the heart is really the only organ that can cause a sudden death, right? You can be healthy and still die. That to me it was unacceptable, right? Because I would look at my own father and think, what could happen to him? Could he all of a sudden not wake up one morning? And so I became obsessed with the heart. My mother took full advantage of this obsession. She would say, if you don't study hard, your dad will develop heart failure. So she was a great mother. It wasn't, but yeah, but she had a sort of manipulative element. You know, I would lie in bed looking at the ceiling fan and see how fast the ceiling fan was moving and time the revolutions with my own heartbeat. You know, it was something that I became very interested in, very obsessed with. And that really led to, you know, ultimately to my choosing a career in cardiology and then writing this book. So in the book, I wanted to convey a couple of different things. One is that the heart is just a biological miracle. The fact that the amount of work that it does unendingly is really one of great, that would astonish. The other aspect that I want to convey is that not only is the heart fascinating, but the history of the heart is also fascinating. You know, most people don't realize that the heart was not operated on until the end of the 19th century. Every other organ had been operated on, including the brain, but not the heart. So there are some obvious reasons why that would be, right? The heart is always moving. It's very hard to cut into something that's moving in a controlled way. It's very hard to suture something that's moving. So how did we develop the technology and the knowledge to actually operate on the human heart? That's a big aspect of the you know, of the story that I tell. You know, of course, those of you who know about medicine know that the answer to that, how do we operate on the heart, is that you have to stop the heart, right? In most cases, you can't operate on a beating heart. How do you stop the heart? Well, there are different ways you can do it, but once you stop the heart, oxygen is no longer transported to the body, right? So the brain will start to die within about 3 minutes or so, right? So the only way to stop the heart is to take over its function with what we now call the heart-lung machine. And that was this fascinating story of how it developed. But I'll just say one more thing about this. Before the heart-lung machine was developed, doctors in the 1950s developed an alternative way of stopping the heart and operating on it. And it was basically by using a parent that acted as a human heart-lung machine for a child. So what would happen is that children, a patient who's going to be operated on, would be connected to their parent via tubes, artery to artery, vein to vein. And the parent's heart would pump oxygenated blood through the child and then pump waste products out of the parent's kidney while the child's heart was stopped. This was called cross circulation. It's a fascinating story of, you know, what doctors were willing to do, what they had to do to operate on this organ that never stops beating. It's a huge conundrum. They also had to solve other problems. Once you stop the heart and you cut it open, the blood's going to leak out. So how do you stop a patient from exsanguinating? That was another sort of technological hurdle that had to be crossed. So it's really a fascinating story, and I tell the story of you know, heart surgery. I tell the story of stents, how they were developed. I tell the story of pacemakers and defibrillators and all these things that we now take for granted. All these things were developed really after the Second World War. I mean, it's relatively new innovations, right, that have taken place. these are not centuries old, advances. These advances took place really over the last about 60 years or so. Heart transplants, stents, all these things. And this is the last thing I'm going to say before we start our discussion, is that, with all the development of technology, machinery, transplants, pacemakers, and so on, stents, an idea developed that the human heart is just a pump, right? In fact, the heart-lung machine takes over for the heart, for the biological heart. So obviously the heart is just a pump that you can replace with a mechanical object and do whatever do whatever needs to be done. One of the main themes of my book is that paradigm is totally wrong and insufficient. And I would say one of the main themes of the book is that there is an emotional heart, okay? In other words, there's the heart that the Greeks and the Romans and ancient civilizations conceptualized, which was like the repository of emotions, right? How many times have we heard, take heart to convey a sense of courage, or we link the heart with emotions like love. It's in our language, right? Too many scientists today think those are totally wrong and outdated concepts. But one of the main arguments of the book is that the emotional heart and this biological heart are deeply, deeply connected. That emotional stress, if you will, has incredibly harmful effects on the heart, and the resolution of stress can have huge benefits. And this is a long story, that started, centuries, millennia ago. That one sort of step in that understanding came in the early part of the 20th century, when a Harvard anthropologist named Walter Cannon observed this phenomenon called Voodoo Death. Now, some of you probably heard of Voodoo Death, right? Voodoo Death is this fascinating phenomenon where oh, sorry. Did anyone hear anything I said? Okay. Okay, good. I was okay, all right. So Voodoo Death is this phenomenon where it tended to happen in sort of, let's say, primitive societies, like Australian Aborigines, where witch doctors would put a curse on somebody. They would point a bone at them. It's called boning. Or they would put a curse on them for eating taboo fruit. And people would literally die on the spot. Or they would die within 24 hours. They would develop such massive stress over this curse that had been put on them that their bodies would literally wither away. And we know now that kind of massive stress leads to direct physiological effects on the heart. And some of you probably know of this syndrome called broken heart syndrome. Okay, it's something that's not a sort of Valentine's Day, or not sort of this fake information. It's actually a real phenomenon where people who develop deep emotional stress over the death of a loved one or the breakup of a romantic relationship will develop a physical changes to the shape of their heart. the heart will physically weaken because of the stress. And it's, we sort of colloquially refer to as broken heart syndrome, but there's an official name for it in the cardiology literature. It's called Tacosubo Cardiomyopathy. It was first seen decades ago, but more and more we're seeing that this is a real phenomenon. And I see this, I would say, you know, multiple times a month, where someone will come in to the hospital, they will have all the symptoms of a heart attack. They'll be short of breath, they'll have chest pain, they'll have EKG changes, and then we do testing, and there's nothing wrong with their heart, or let's say the arteries that feed their heart, there are no blockages. They're not having a real heart attack, but the emotional stress puts such a strain on their heart that their heart actually physically changes shape, and it mimics a heart attack. And in some cases, patients die. Their hearts weaken to the point where they have a lack of transported oxygen, and they die like those Australian Aborigines who were cursed by the witch doctor. It's a real phenomenon, and you know, we see this kind of acute response to stress, not just in personal relationships, but you can even see it after hurricanes or after natural disasters, like tornadoes and so on, where people lose a lot of things. They lose their homes, or and they develop this stress response, and you see the prevalence of this heart condition go up dramatically when there's you know, natural disasters and so on. So you know, acute stress, I argue in my book, is a manifestation of what I call the metaphorical heart, right? The metaphorical heart is like the heart of the Greeks. The Greeks said the heart is the repository of the emotions, right? But it's real also. It's not just purely metaphor, that the metaphorical heart and the biological heart intersect. And that's, you know, through stress, or, you know, through however you want to say it, but there are clear-cut connections between the emotions and heart health. Not just acutely, but chronically too, right? There have been studies in England called the Whitehall studies, where they looked at civil servants, and they graded the civil servants based on the autonomy on the job, right? And they found that administrators had much better life expectancy than messengers and porters. Why? Because administrators had more occupational autonomy. They were higher in the social hierarchy. And those who were lower in the social hierarchy died much quicker of heart problems, even though they had the same amount of cholesterol in their blood, they drank the same, they smoked the same number of cigarettes, right? All these sort of risk factors that we think about, diabetes, you know, obesity, cholesterol, blood pressure, these are conventional risk factors. But the fact is that these risk factors don't explain all heart disease. There's a lot of heart disease that occurs in people with none of these risk factors. And my argument is that emotional risk factors are a major driver of heart disease. And in other words, the metaphorical heart intersects with the biological heart. And it's not just humans. We see this in animals also. So I'm going to say one other thing, and then we can discuss or take questions. One of my favorite studies that I mentioned in the book was published in Science. So Science, you know, is a incredibly prestigious journal, as some of you are aware, probably the most prestigious journal in the world. So these researchers took rabbits, and they fed them a high cholesterol diet, okay, to see the effect of high cholesterol on the development of heart disease. Seems like a very reasonable thing to do. After a certain amount of time of consuming this high-fat diet, the rabbits were autopsied. And it turned out that rabbits that were caged high up in the room, like close to the ceiling, had much more heart disease even after consuming the same diet as rabbits in cages on the floor. So this was a huge surprise, right? Why would the location of the cages affect the development of heart disease? So the researchers speculated that it was because of air circulation, or maybe there were some pollutants that were higher up. They didn't know. So they repeated the study. So what seemed to be clear to them after investigating is they found that the rabbits that were in the higher cages could not be reached by the person who came in to put food into their cages. So those rabbits were essentially isolated from human touch. The rabbits in the lower cages got the same diet, but the helper would come in, take the rabbits out, pet them, talk to them, play with them, love them. So the researchers repeated the study. All the rabbits got the same diet, high-fat diet, but half the rabbits were taken out of their cages, talked to, petted, and half the rabbits were kept in their cages and remained in isolation. The rabbits that were taken out of their cages and spoken to and loved by a person developed 40% less heart disease, even with the same diet as those rabbits that were isolated. So, the point is that our emotions and our minds, our brains, have tremendous effects on our hearts. And we think of the heart as an emotional organ, right? You broke my heart. There's so many metaphors that we use to convey emotions, but one of the main arguments of the book, along with sort of the history of heart disease and technology and all this, one of the main arguments is that technology alone will not explain the human heart. That there are these sort of metaphorical intangibles that the ancients knew about, that we in the modern age are now just beginning to see with broken heart syndrome, Tacosubo Cardiomyopathy, and so on. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, but we can have a conversation, or I'll just take questions. And I realize this is the last session, I think, so we can just finish. It's people just probably want to leave, so I will not take offense. But if you want to ask questions or whatever, I'm happy to take them.
I have a few questions.
Yeah.
Last but not the least, it might be the most important session in the whole festival. Everyone was waiting for it.
Okay.
Let's talk about the open heart. You said it really started after World War II.
Yeah.
How did they solve this puzzle of slowing down the heart and connecting it and working through all the problems?
At first they used humans, right? They used parents. But that was a massive undertaking. It was an ethically fraught undertaking, right? Because one of the critics of this sort of human heart-lung machine or human heart-lung connection said that this is the only surgery in human history that could kill two people. right? So it was very controversial. The reason it had to be used was because we didn't have a heart-lung machine. The history of how the heart-lung machine develops is not one I can give in 5 minutes. It's a fascinating story. It was essentially developed by a husband-wife team that used to take cats off the streets of Boston at Harvard and developed this whole way of oxygenating blood by dripping it through a column and having oxygen diffuse into the blood, which is essentially how a heart-lung machine works. And it was an undertaking that this husband-wife team took. John Gibbon was the scientist, and his wife Mary. It was an undertaking that they took from 1927 until 1950, right? So 23 years it took them to develop the heart-lung machine. It's a fascinating story, but that was the solution to the problem.
Tell us something about the first pacemaker, how it was done, because that itself is a fascinating story, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there are many different ways that you can die, right, via the heart. One is that the heart speeds up so much and becomes chaotic. That's called ventricular fibrillation. And that is treated through defibrillators, which is its own fascinating story. But another way you can die is the heart slows down so much that it just, the rate of the heart is so slow that it doesn't pump enough blood. So the solution to that was developing a pacemaker, actually putting in wires into the heart to control the heartbeat. And that, again, was also done in the late 1950s by several different groups, but one was this kind of weird guy named Wilson Greatbatch, who used to work in upstate New York. And he developed these ideas working with sheep. But it was interesting because so much of what was developed in heart technology was because of serendipity. In his case, he connected a capacitor of the wrong type in a circuit, and the circuit started to sort of pulsate once per second. And he immediately recognized that that might have some applications to the human heart. And this circuit that he sort of developed by accident then was essentially put into a pacemaker. And of course, there are many, many steps that had to occur, but that was really the impetus for developing the pacemaker.
I read recently that the heart can also release certain peptides that can affect the brain itself. Is that something that has any practical relevance?
I mean, I don't know if it has practical developments, but I mean, the heart and the brain, if what I've been saying is that there is a very strong connection between our minds and our hearts, and it's two-way traffic. So it's not just that the brain, creates a stressful state that then affects the heart, but the heart itself can create emotional states. I've had many patients who develop arrhythmias where their hearts speed up and just the palpitations cause them to develop panic attacks. So there is a two-way traffic between the brain and the heart.
I also read recently that with the changes in 5G and 6G, we are seeing more atrial fibrillation. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, people have been talking about cell phones and their effects on the heart. Oh, people have been talking about cell phones and their effect on the heart for, for decades. I'm not sure if 5G, 4G, whatever is But the fact is that atrial fibrillation, which is a condition very, very common, probably the most common arrhythmia, where the heart sort of beats chaotically, but and speeds up, but it's in the upper chambers, not the lower chambers. So if it's in the lower chambers, that's ventricular fibrillation, which is incompatible with life. Atrial fibrillation is not incompatible with life. But I see more and more atrial fibrillation, probably because of stress. We've seen a lot more because of COVID, both from direct effects of COVID and the virus on the heart, but also the emotional stress of the pandemic, social distancing, isolation, loneliness, also has affected our hearts and caused people to develop more and more arrhythmias. So yeah, so that's what I'd say about that.
So let's open the questions to the floor. If anyone is interested, has any cardiac concerns, please go ahead.
The biological aspects of heart disease are spoken very abundantly about in the magazines and everywhere, but the emotional aspect which you just touched upon is talked very less about, and so many people like me only don't know, which you just actually told us all about.
Yeah.
And recently also, fittest of the people, we have seen they have died of heart attacks. So that also is a kind of mystery to us, that people who are so fit, how can they die of heart attack?
Yeah.
So do you think that there is a reason for that, or these companies, they have a reason to just touch on the biological aspect of it and not on the emotional?
Yeah, I mean, look, doctors have essentially ignored the emotional component of heart disease. And I explain why in the book, that some of the most seminal studies, like the Framingham study, that basically showed that heart disease is traceable to certain risk factors like diabetes, high blood pressure, and so on. The Framingham investigators deliberately ignored emotional aspects of the patients. In fact, initially there were questionnaires about marital stability and occupational satisfaction and so on. Those were discarded because the Framingham investigators really wanted a rigorous study. So it's easy to quantify how many cigarettes you smoke or what your serum cholesterol is. But it's much harder to quantify how much stress you have. So they got rid of it. And I think that was to the detriment of our field. I went through cardiology training in New York. I don't remember one time a senior physician talking about the effect of stress on the heart. We learned about coronary disease, plaques, fatty plaques, LDL, all those things that we know about, blood pressure and so on, but no one ever talked about emotional stress. And, it's sort of understandable why, as a doctor. It's easy for me to prescribe a pill to lower your blood pressure. It's easy for me to prescribe a pill to lower your cholesterol. It's very difficult for me to lower your emotional stress level, right? That's a highly personal thing, and doctors like to do things that they have control over. So we focus on the things that we can do: cholesterol, diabetes, blood pressure. We don't want to talk about emotional stress. But the fact remains that emotional stress is a major factor, and it's one of the things. I mean, I've touched on a number of different topics, but if you're interested in learning the basis by which I make this assertion, then you should read the book, because there's a lot there that I think can really help people understand what's important about their hearts and their physical health.
So, doctor, the part about the mind and body, heart and body influencing each other is perfectly fine. What I want to know is, and I ask you because you mentioned it, How do you explain voodoo death, for instance, when someone's placing a curse, and this is obviously over a distance? How does that work?
Over what?
Over a distance.
Yeah.
And so, and I want an answer from your paradigm,
Yeah.
the medical paradigm. How does that work?
It's exactly what I said. It's not, there's no sort of action at a distance, right? I mean, so voodoo death is a psychological phenomenon. It's that people who feel that they've been cursed develop such massive
Stress levels.
physiological overactivity through the sympathetic nervous system that their hearts gallop, their blood pressure rises, and their hearts eventually weaken to the point where, you know, it's incompatible with life. So I would say that there are physical reasons why it happens, but it's all driven by our minds.
So this makes sense when the person who's going to get attacked knows that someone is attacking. Now in India we have numerous instances of, black magic, tantric magic.
Yeah.
Where they do a very, very similar thing, where the person who's getting attacked doesn't know that he or
Yeah.
she is being attacked.
Yeah.
But it still works exactly the way you're saying it.
Yeah.
So what happens?
That I don't know. That I honestly don't know. Voodoo death, the way Walter Cannon observed it,
Right.
was a state where the victim was aware of what had been done to them and was unable to cope with the stress of it.
Fascinating insight, Doctor. Thank you so much, because I feel I've got a very important insight without having read the book. But
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any studies to suggest that the emotional well-being of a human being or any patient have helped him in reducing the amount of tablets which he was having before the diagnosis of some kind of a heart disease?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, there's, without sort of revealing all the book's secrets, there are very well done studies that have shown that stress reduction is as effective for heart health as exercise, as physical exercise.
We have time for one more question. Anyone interested?
One more question.
Yeah. Is someone else going? Doctor?
No, go ahead.
So, yeah, there's been a lot of studies that have been done among the economically weaker sections of society, the poor, that understands their decision making and the stress and the effect of scarcity, right, that they go through. Has there been any healthcare or heart-related studies that have been done on the economically weaker sections of the society and mental health-related heart issues as well?
Yeah, I mean, the economically most depressed sections, at least of American society, have much more heart disease than those, groups that are more, affluent and privileged. Black Americans have very high rates of heart disease. They have very high rates of hypertension. Now, some people say that's because of genetics, but if you look at the ancestors of Black Americans, from West Africa, they don't have high blood pressure, right? They don't have high blood pressure. So Black Americans have developed high blood pressure. Now, is it because of diet? Is it because of racism? Is it because of, living in disadvantaged communities? Obviously not all, but by and large, there's a lot of disadvantage, in African Americans in American society. So, we don't know all the answers, but there are certainly hypotheses that social factors cause, more heart disease among, economically disadvantaged groups.
Well, thank you, everyone. Sandeep, this was amazing. We learned a lot from you.
Sure.
And I appreciate you all. Thank you for a great session.
No, no, please.
I think I'm going over there to sign books if anyone wants.
If anyone has a book that they want to get signed, there's a book signing area towards the right of the venue. Thank you, Mr. Sandeep Jauhar and Mr. Pariksith Singh.